First, I would really like to thank the organizers for giving me the opportunity to present my research. And I would also like to thank the speakers for their interesting talks. It's really too bad we couldn't meet in person, but it was impressive how our ideas were similar at the end. And I was especially pleased to see that despite the interdisciplinary nature of our small community, most of us share a sort of common intention, which I believe is very similar to the original aim of aesthetics as it was defined by Baumgarten as the science of sensory knowledge directed toward beauty. So I entitled my first slide "To Feel or Flee" because it tells a lot about my research question, which is, broadly speaking, what is it that make us feel sensations and emotions? Why do not we simply move around like zombies or robots, but instead feel our life in our body and in our mind? What is it that stops us from simply reacting to our environment, and what instead enables us to consciously go through experiences? Or on the contrary, what is it that makes us sensory and emotionally numb? Like Icarus in this painting, who fled from the labyrinth and then kept flying toward the sun without feeling that he was going on fire. So in terms of free energy minimization, this question corresponds to the so-called dark room problem, which is one of the most popular critiques to predictive coding. So yesterday we already discussed this problem. So very briefly, this paradox goes like this. Why do we not simply hide in a dark room and avoid all uncertainty if our final goal is to minimize uncertainty? What brings us out of the dark room? Well, as it has been already said yesterday, the thing is that we need a certain level of uncertainty to keep getting better at predicting our environment. So tolerating uncertainty and inviting chaos can allow us to learn new layers of regularities in reality. So we don't hide in a dark room because we don't expect to stay in a dark room, because we expect to learn ever deeper layers of regularities. We expect to keep learning over time. But then again, we might ask ourselves, what teaches us to expect to keep learning over time? I believe that beauty, our sense of beauty, has something to do with this. And I will try to explain you why during this presentation, which is focused on the relation between beauty and perceptual learning. So here is my timeline. I will very briefly sum up the evidence from neuroimaging studies with a good spatial and temporal resolution. Then I will present you our model of aesthetic appreciation that we use to interpret this evidence. And then I will focus more in detail on its prediction regarding the link between learning dynamics and aesthetic pleasure. And finally, I will show you the results from a couple of EEG mismatch negativity studies that we designed to test our hypothesis in the domain of musical perception. So from MRI neuroaesthetic studies, we can tell that during aesthetic appreciation, three things happen. First, there is an activation in the frontal reward network, which is paralleled by both motor inhibition of the primary motor areas and by an increased activation in primary and associative sensory areas, including mirror areas. So such an increased activation resembles those underlying attentional enhancement. Unfortunately, I don't have time to review also the EEG results, but just let me say that the presence of motor inhibition and attentional enhancement is also testified by electrophysiological results as well as by behavioral results. So we interpreted the co-presence of attentional enhancements and motor inhibition during aesthetic appreciation as it follows. According to our stopping for knowledge hypothesis, a context-driven aesthetic attitude, which is, for example, being a museum, or else a content-driven attentional capture that is driven by the object beautiful features, is able to produce a significant increase in perceptual learning, intended as the update of predictive representations of the environment. In turn, this increasing the magnitude of the update of representation is followed by both the activation in reward areas underlying perceptual pleasure and motor inhibition. So according to our model, aesthetic pleasure is indeed a self-generated hedonic feedback of the update of predictive representations, which signals to our brain that current percepts are profitable in terms of information gain. As you might have noticed already, I'm not saying anything new here. So this is just putting things together. Most of these aspects have been discussed before by many authors, apart maybe from motor inhibition, which has been widely neglected. But then again, I guess that some concepts by Gallese and by Menninghaus went pretty close to it. But this is, of course, just half of the story, because as any reward, aesthetic pleasure might function not only as feedback of learning, but also as an incentive, motivating us to direct attentional resources to most informative stimuli. So attention, pleasure, and motor inhibition are linked within a loop that constitutes aesthetic experiences. Updating of representation is aesthetically pleasing, and vice versa, aesthetic pleasure updates our representations and makes us expect future learning progresses within the present sensory context. So in sum, aesthetic pleasure also signals to the system that it's time to stop acting according to previously acquired routines and to learn something new. In terms of free energy minimization, this means that since both action and perception are directed to minimize surprise, aesthetic pleasure signals that it's more profitable to update representations rather than acting based on internal representation. Or else this means focusing on intrinsic epistemic value rather than on utility. Attentional resources are thus moved from action to perception, perhaps through the modulation of the gain of the incoming prediction error. This means that the relation between perceptual learning and beauty is twofold. Aesthetic pleasure is both a feedback and a trigger of perceptual learning. So now I will present you two EEG studies that were designed specifically to investigate this twofold relation. So the first question is, can we describe beauty as a feedback from the successful learning of sensory irregularities? So I will now describe a study measuring the mismatch negativity response during the perception of two streams of sounds composed by more and less appreciated sounds. The mismatch negativity is a well-known index of perceptual learning, which is obtained by subtracting the evoked response to standard events from that elicited by deviant events. The larger is the mismatch negativity, the more you are learning sensory irregularities from the environment. Here we employed a mismatch negativity roving paradigm, where a stream of sounds, of two sounds with different frequency is presented. Every time the sound changes, this is considered deviant, while those following a sound with the same frequency are considered as standards. Notice also that for each trial stimulus, we computed the corresponding Bayesian surprise, which is an information theoretic index of sensory surprise for, let's say, information gain. Participants were presented with two sound streams, one composed by perfect fifth two-note intervals, and the other one was composed by less consonant tritone intervals. The particularity of this experiment is that participants' preferences were paired, so that an half of participants preferred tritones more than fifths, and while the remaining preferred fifths more than fifth intervals more than tritones. So the analyses were performed after grouping results according to subjective preferences and independently from objective features, in this case, the consonance level. So for example, if I appreciated the perfect fifth more than tritons, my mismatch negativity corresponding to fifth intervals was assigned to the preferred group and the other way around. So therefore, preferred and non-preferred EEG responses were merged into two different groups according to subjective preferences and served as an input for subsequent analysis. This analysis strategy was equal both in the mismatch negativity analysis and in the correlation between amplitude and Bayesian surprise. So firstly, I will show you the mismatch negativity results. Here we have the amplitudes at frontal electrodes and latencies on the x-axis. So you can see that standard and deviant responses to preferred and non-preferred sounds. The difference between the two is particularly evident for deviant responses in purple, where unpredicted, surprising stimuli conveyed by preferred sounds triggered greater responses. In the next slide, you will see the mismatch negativity, which is the differential wave obtained by subtracting standard responses, here in green, to deviant responses in purple. So as predicted, the point-by-point t-test we performed to compare preferred and non-preferred mismatch negativities revealed a significant cluster corresponding to the mismatch negativity latency and scalp distribution. So the mismatch negativity index of perceptual learning is greater for more appreciated sounds. The cool thing is that this is true even when separating the sample in two groups. Participants who prefer tritons, this one here, show larger mismatch negativity responses to tritons and vice versa for people who preferred fifths. So we can say that in this study, perceptual learning performances follow subjective preferences. Now I want to show you the results from the trial-by-trial correlation between EEG amplitudes and Bayesian surprise. So we employed this correlation analysis to investigate sensory surprise encoding. Bayesian surprise is computed as the Kullback-Leibler divergence between the prior and posterior distribution over the occurrence of sound after a given trial. And it captured the information gain conveyed by the stimulus. The correlation between Bayesian surprise and EEG responses thus measures the sensitivity of sensory cortices to sensory surprise, or else said, it captures how much our brain is attuned with the sensory environment and able to learn from it, how much sensations influence internal models. So as we predicted, sensory surprise encoding is ameliorated during the perception of more appreciated sounds, as reflected by a stronger correlation in the preferred condition at the same latency of the mismatch negativity here. So this slide is saying us that if we can minimize uncertainty either by changing our mind or by changing the world, then aesthetic appreciation is associated with a focus on changing our mind. So in sum, this study demonstrates that aesthetic pleasure might be a feedback of perceptual learning dynamics. So the more you learn it, the more you learn from it, the more you like it. So let's now move to the second study I want to present in this talk. This study aims at responding to the second question, which is whether aesthetic appreciation promotes further perceptual learning enhancements, even minutes after music listening. So the methodology here was very similar to the first experiment, but here the mismatch negativity roving paradigm follows 5 minutes of music listening. We employed 4 musical excerpts of 5 minutes each. These were played both forward and backward. So we had 8 runs in total, and musical pieces were paired for tempo and key. Once again, we were interested in the effect brought by subjective preferences rather than objective features. So as in experiment 1, we separated mismatch negativity results corresponding to the 4 most appreciated musical pieces and to the 4 least appreciated musical pieces in 2 groups, the preferred and the non-preferred group. So the results that you will see are either referred to the non-preferred condition or to the preferred condition. So we expected that if aesthetic appreciation were able to enhance perceptual learning even minutes after listening to music, we would observe larger mismatch negativities following preferred music compared to non-preferred music. And this is exactly what we observed. So the mismatch negativity index of perceptual learning, peaking here at about 150 milliseconds after onset, is larger after listening to preferred musical stimuli. So let me just acknowledge that as a critic, it could be said that what I presented you is based solely on electrophysiological data and reverse inference. So since I believe this critic to be very important, let me point out that we usually design studies so as to include also behavioral experiment and to anchor electrophysiological results to behavioral data. And this is also the case of the 2 studies I just presented. So they were both part of a broader set of experiments, which unfortunately I didn't have the time to present. But if anyone is interested, I can share some more data later. So to conclude, I started this talk asking, these were the take-home message from the 2nd study. So the more you like it, the more you learn from it. To conclude, I started this talk by asking myself, what makes humans so sensible? The take-home message is that beauty might be an hedonic feedback signaling information gains and motivating us to direct attention to perception and learning, rather than acting based on prior beliefs. This means that the ability to perceive beauty is quite an important evolutionary advantage that differentiates us from less evolved animals and machines. So differently from machine, we do not respond mechanically with routinary actions, but we are able to experience a wide range of novel and unexpected sensory states. So may beauty be the force that take us beyond the free energy principle imperative of limiting the set of sensory states we live in. I want to conclude with a quote by the famous psychologist James Hillman, who has dedicated a lot of his work to aesthetic sensibility. So he wrote that arts are not hobbies, but challenge a collective anesthesia. So without arts, we will become insensible toward each other and emotionally numb with respect to our environment. So that's it. And I would like to thank you for your attention. And this is my group.